Okay, welcome. Good evening and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the webinar, What Does It Mean to Have ADHD? Presented by Dr. Eric Deibler. My name is Katie Delaney. I am the Family and Medical Outreach Coordinator at the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders. I will be your facilitator for this evening. Now, before I introduce Dr. Deibler, here are the housekeeping notes. All participants are muted. If you have any questions, please type it in the bottom of your question box and click send. If you have questions after tonight's session, you can post your questions on the Wednesday webinar blog, which is accessed from our homepage at www.njcts.org under the heading Programs. This blog will be monitored for the next 7 days. The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, its directors and employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of the information presented on our site. We do not endorse any recommendations or opinion made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Eric Deibler. Dr. Deibler has been a school psychologist for 30 years, holding a master's degree in school psychology and a doctorate in clinical psychology. He has worked in a variety of settings, serving children with mental health needs, including public and private schools, self-contained outpatient hospital programs, self-contained outpatient programs. Dr. Deibler recently retired from the Burlington County Special Services School District, where he served as a psychologist for 19 years. He is currently a consultant for his wife's practice, the Center of Emotional Health of Greater Philadelphia, CEH. He specializes in clinical diagnostic work and therapeutic services for children with severe mental illness. We are so happy to have you here tonight, Dr. Deibler. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. So yes, I've been in the field for over 30 years now, licensed clinical psychologist and certified school psychologist, and I've worked in all those settings that were just mentioned. And one of the things that has come up the most frequently is the topic and diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And this isn't surprising because it is the most common, by most statistics that you look at, most common of the 4 most commonly diagnosed mental health conditions in children. ADHD being number 1, anxiety being number 2, behavioral problems, although that encompasses a lot of different diagnoses, number 3, and depression is number 4. Now, these conditions you can have more than one of them, so it isn't like they're 4 separate things. In fact, they often commonly co-occur. But we do see this every day in all of these settings. And one thing that has been consistent from the time that I started in my first graduate program in 1989 until today is that ADHD is commonly misunderstood by practitioners, by parents, by a lot of different people. It's a much more complicated diagnosis. It's a much more complicated condition than many people realize. And I had trouble coming up with a good title for this. I usually want to come up with something pithy that kind of encapsulates everything. But really what I want to get across is that attention and hyperactivity are often the least of the issues with ADHD. And we're going to be talking about what the real issues are like and what it's really like to experience them and to deal with them. So what we're going to be talking about tonight, we do have to go over some of the diagnostic basics. I mean, I know these, the diagnostic criteria are very commonly available, but there's nuance to them that isn't always understood. So we're going to go over them as much as we need to, but then we're going to move on. We're going to talk about the concept of the ADHD iceberg, which will be clear once we see it. And we're really going to focus on the idea of executive function. And this is the main thing that's going on in ADHD. And this has become clearer over the years, where now it seems like this is the primary issue that's going on with ADHD. And you have to understand this if you want to understand the condition itself. So once we get to that, that's where we're going to talk about what ADHD really looks like, and then how you can use these things to work with your children or with yourself. So first, the diagnostic criteria. Almost all of our criteria in our book, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, they follow a similar pattern where they're going to demonstrate, like, here's the main thing, here's the criteria, and it has to have a negative effect. So here's the ones for ADHD. So ADHD, people with ADHD show a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity and impulsivity, you don't have to have both, that interferes with function or development. So you have to have that component. It has to interfere with something important. Now, they're separated in two groups of symptoms. There's inattention and there's impulsivity, hyperactivity, and they follow a similar pattern. So from the first group, depending on your age, you either need 5 or 6 of symptoms. 6 if you're underage, 16 or under, only 5 if you're 17 or older. They have to have been present for at least 6 months. They are inappropriate for your particular age or developmental level. And one way to think of this is that a child who is 5 years old does not and cannot pay attention the same way a child who is 15 years old might. So it has to be out of proportion or otherwise inappropriate or concerning for the age. So here are the symptoms. And remember, you need either 5 or 6 of these. Failing to pay close attention to details, making careless mistakes, having trouble holding attention to tasks or activities, doesn't seem to listen, doesn't follow through on instructions, fails to finish things, has trouble organizing tasks, avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to do tasks that require mental effort over a long period of time, meaning, like maintaining focus for long enough. They avoid activities like that, like doing homework, doing lengthy, complicated tasks they may avoid. Often loses things that are necessary for tasks, is easily distracted, and is often forgetful. The next group is hyperactivity and impulsivity thing. It's still going to be the same kind of format. You need 6 or more symptoms if you're 16 or older, 5 or more if you're 16 or younger, 5 or more if you're 17 or older. Same thing. They've been present for at least 6 months. That is disruptive and inappropriate for your developmental level. So the symptoms here are fidgeting or tapping with hands or feet, squirming in your seat, inappropriate excessive movement, often leaving seats in situations where remaining seated is to be expected, runs about or climbs in situations where it's not appropriate, like say in a classroom, climbing over desks or filing cabinets, things like that. Unable to play or take part in leisure activities quietly, and that's like a volume that is excessive for the age. Often on the go, acting as if driven by motor, talking excessively, blurting out an answer before the question has been completed, difficulty waiting for a turn, and interrupting and intruding on others in games or other kinds of situations. Again, none of these behaviors are unusual. What you're looking for is something that's excessive for the age and disruptive. So beyond that, there have to be a few other criteria. You have to have shown some of these symptoms at least before the age of 12. So you can diagnose people who are older, but they have to have shown symptoms from before they're 12. So if you have no symptoms throughout childhood, and then you're reporting these symptoms at 18 years old, you're going to be looking into different conditions, and ADHD is not going to apply. The symptoms have to be present in 2 or more settings. So you can't just have trouble at school and not at home, or vice versa. So parents may report things at home, no trouble at school. If it isn't in 2 places, it's not going to qualify. There has to be evidence that these symptoms are clearly interfering with or otherwise negatively affecting the quality of function in 1 or more settings. So it has to be having an impact. It has to be having a negative effect on things that they want to or need to do. And the last one, and this is common with everything, the symptoms aren't better explained by something else, like a medical condition or another disorder that could have attention. That's our criteria for everything. You have to rule out other causes. So if you meet all of those things, you'll meet the diagnosis of ADHD. And I think a lot of people will stop at that point, thinking that they do understand what's going on, but it doesn't necessarily cover everything. Last word on this diagnostic point. The number of symptoms you have in each category will be what differentiates the subtype of ADHD. So if you have enough symptoms in both areas, that's like 5 or 6, in each of those areas, in attention and impulsivity, you're going to get what's called a combined presentation. This is probably the most common one, and often the one that has the most behavioral issues associated with it. If you have only enough to qualify for the inattentive part, but not the hyperactive part, you're going to get predominantly inattentive presentation. If you have the reverse, you're going to get predominantly hyperactive impulsive presentation. And you can see all of these. One thing that's worth thinking about, you'll hear people say ADD versus ADHD. That is about 25 years out of date. They haven't talked about it that way in a long time. They no longer call it ADD, without the hyperactivity. With the main thought is that the impulsivity is by far more likely to be in any of the presentations. And the predominantly inattentive type may actually be a different condition. They're not really sure about that, but it is interesting that the medications you give for this are more effective in general for the hyperactivity and impulsivity, and less so for the inattentive part. So a lot of times if people have hyperactivity and impulsivity, they get a better effect from medication than perhaps they may from the inattentive type. Now, this is a very commonly used metaphor these days, the ADHD iceberg, and this particular one was taken from Jonathan Wolfe and his U-Time coaching practice. This is a particularly good one, but this is popular because it really does reflect the idea of what's going on in ADHD. The whole idea of the iceberg, and there's things that are visible on top and things that are invisible below. So in this metaphor, the top of the iceberg, the part that you can see, is the behavior. This is the stuff that is acting outward, the impulsivity and the poor focus. The other things are the things that are more experienced by the person, and they're less easy to observe. But these reflect more along the lines of what is going on with the person. Difficulties in emotional control, problems with stress tolerance, difficulties planning, prioritizing, organizing, starting tasks, being able to change tasks when, or change when demands change, being able to keep things in your memory, managing time, all of this kind of stuff. Now, what I'm going to be making the case for here is that this is the area that is the most significant. This is the area that is most impacted, and this is the area that is actually the least visible to anybody else. You can see the behavior, but you can't see the person's inner mental process. So this brings us to the idea of executive function. Now, this is a somewhat theoretical group of organizing principles in the brain, although over the years, the evidence has gotten stronger and stronger that this is an actual thing. It isn't just an idea. It does seem to be a system in the brain that helps control actions. And I like this particular description. There's many of them, but this is a nice short one. And this is from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University, and that is not a typo. It is Center on the Developing Child, not Center for the Developing Child or Center for Child Development. That is the name that they picked. It's a campus-wide program of a lot of different disciplines. But this is their definition that they put on their website. Executive function and self-regulation skills are the mental processes that enable us to plan, focus attention, remember instructions, and juggle multiple tasks successfully. Just as an air traffic control system at a busy airport safely manages the arrival and departure of many aircrafts on multiple runways, the brain needs this skill set to filter distractions, prioritize tasks, set and achieve goals, and to control impulses. Now, I want to point out one thing they say here. This is the one part that I wish they had maybe phrased differently. Juggle multiple tasks makes it sound like multitasking, but that's not the same thing. What they really mean is understanding what needs to be done next, out of many options, and prioritizing what you're doing, which is definitely a different thing. And we're going to talk a little bit about multitasking too. So these executive functions, the research generally supports that there are 7 basic executive functions. There's self-awareness, and in this sense, they mean it's a conscious awareness of what you're doing, so that you know what you're doing, you know how it's going, and you're evaluating what is happening in yourself, like what you're actually doing. There's the concept of inhibition, which is the ability to control impulses, self-restraint, basically to not do a behavior. So you can see how that plays into impulsivity. The idea of not acting out when you think of something, give yourself a little bit of room before you act. Nonverbal working memory, And that is pretty much what people think of when they think of short-term memory. It's the idea of actually holding mental images, but it also involves things like a sense of time, anticipation, and future goals. It's the idea of how much time has passed and how much time is remaining. Verbal working memory is really a very concrete skill. That's having a certain amount of verbal information that you can hold in your brain for long enough to work on and maybe to transfer it into long-term memory. And the example that most people will use for this is that they believe that you can hold basically 7 bits of unrelated information, like 7 numbers, 7 letters, that are not related to each other. If you can make them related to each other, you can make them into 1 bit of information. But something like 7 numbers you can hold for a few seconds, and that is the genesis of the 7-number phone number, because they figured that was the most that people could hold in their brain for long enough to be able to write it down. So then they came up with area codes. It's like a separate thing. That's another story. But that is just like the ability of, like, how long can you hold something in your head before you forget it once you hear it? Emotional regulation is, can you modulate your own emotions? Can you hold back a reaction? Can you hold back an angry reaction? This is a very long and complicated subject in and of itself. We'll try and touch on it if we have time, but it is part of executive functions. Motivational regulation is exactly that. Can you keep yourself working on something? It's internal motivation, self-directed, internal stimulation. Can you do it without having somebody tell you to do it? And planning and problem solving. But in this sense, it means, can you have a mental plan? Can you come up with a plan that you can evaluate with that self-awareness and realize, okay, is this working? Do I need to change something? Can I fix this in some way to make it better? So all of these functions are absolutely vital to being able to do things within a time frame, to being able to do things without guidance, and to be able to stay organized and on task. And these are the functions that are impacted in ADHD. So I want to point out something here. I'm going to bring it back to this slide. Just in inattention alone, what I did here was I highlighted the symptoms of inattention that involve executive functions. And you can see just from these highlights, every single one of them is involved in at least one of those major executive functions. So trouble holding attention, doesn't seem to listen, not following through on instructions, organizing tasks. These are all direct results of executive dysfunction. So what is ADHD really like? The first thing I want to tell you about, before I'm going to tell you a lot of little stories here, but the first thing I want to tell you about is that when we go through all these things, the thing to remember that one of the most important aspects of executive function is self-awareness. So one of the things that's impacted in this is that people are generally less aware of their executive functions. So they're not necessarily aware that they are not doing these things well. And we'll explore a little bit as to why. So let's look at these different aspects. If you have these deficits in executive function, what is it like? The working memory problem. If you just look at verbal working memory, the idea of catching information, holding it in your short-term memory for long enough to do something with it, to write it down, to put it into memory. If you're weak in that, you will miss things. And once something is forgotten, it is gone. From short-term memory, you've basically lost it. You don't know that you've necessarily forgotten. So when you have someone who is like hearing a whole bunch of things, like you have to do this assignment, it's on this page, and maybe trying to write it down and being distracted, they miss something in short-term memory, it's gone. So it isn't that they can't do the assignment. They may not have gotten it down, and they may not remember that you said it. So at that point, they're missing something that there's no way they can retrieve it, because if it is lost, it is gone. So we have that issue. The positive illusory bias. And there was different ways that I used to say this in the past, because there's certain, this has always been an issue, but this is maybe the best way to look at it. The positive illusory bias is something, mostly you use this when you're talking about kids. And what it means is that kids overestimate their ability to do things that they're actually weak in. So they overestimate their ability to to perform something well, to do a task, to do well on a test. And this is demonstrable through actual research. You can show this. Kids overestimate their weaknesses. Now, that's nothing, there's nothing abnormal about that. That's just how kids are. And they think that this serves a lot of helpful functions, that if a child believes they can do something, they're more likely to try it. They are less likely to be anxious about how something will turn out. When they do try it, if they fail, they are more likely at this point to say, like, well, I'm sure I can do better. So it actually can shape motivation, it can shape behavior, it can work out well for them. So being realistic may not help them that much. Thinking that they can do stuff when maybe they're not that great at it may actually get them to try it and learn it. So it is not viewed as a negative thing. But there's a very, very important thing about people with ADHD. Kids with ADHD have a very different positive illusory bias. They can show that they have a much more pronounced sense of this than other kids, kids that don't have ADHD. So they think that they're significantly better at the areas that they're actually the weakest in. So it's a bigger bias issue. Now, that may not sound like it's a difficulty, but the problem is with ADHD kids, they've shown that this positive illusory bias doesn't enhance their motivation. It doesn't keep them going for longer. It doesn't change their performance. In general, they think that they can do these things that they're weak at, but it doesn't change how they do any of these things. So they don't necessarily, another way to look at it is, they don't believe they have these weaknesses for the most part. And we see this when we interview kids, when we're doing psychological assessments. We interview the parents, we give them different test measures, like do they have this difficulty, this difficulty. Many times kids with ADHD, they will say that they don't have problems with this. They say, no, I don't have any problems with attention. They're not really aware of it. So this is part of the reason why. Kids with ADHD, their positive illusory bias doesn't really change even when they're given evidence that it's wrong. So they may think, I pay attention very well, even when you can show them that they do have difficulty with it. It doesn't change this feeling. And this is going to become a theme. So it's reflective of the deficit, that they have trouble seeing these things. And the reason they have trouble seeing these things is the ability to see these things is an executive function. So that part is not working the way that it should. And I'm going to bring up one of my favorite studies, mostly because it has a follow-up. I'm not sure how old this study is. It's many decades old. They told us this when I was in driver's ed in high school, and that was 40 years ago. They brought up the idea of the better than the average driver. And it's a social psychology experiment. It's not clinical. It's like more from the academic world. And they would say that like most people rate themselves as a better than average driver, which even if you don't know statistics, that can't possibly be the case. Most people can't be better than average because most people are average, but most people think they're better than that. And for a long time, they used this as an example of saying, well, people have an overinflated sense of their abilities. People have, basically an adult version of the positive illusory bias. They think they're better because they, whatever, like a self-centeredness or something like that. However, in the last 10, maybe 15 years, another group of researchers did a follow-up on this study. And they tried to say, why do people believe they're better than average in this? And what they found was that people who make mistakes when they're driving, people who miss red lights, people who cut somebody off, people who didn't stop at a stop sign, they don't know that they did that. They didn't see it. That's why they went through the light, or that's why they drove too close. They were unaware of it. They are aware when they notice other people making mistakes, and presumably they may miss other mistakes also. They'll see someone else go through a light and say, I can't believe they did that. But as far as they're concerned, they never did that. This is a very important concept. They can't fix mistakes that they don't know that they made. They rate themselves higher because they didn't see the stuff that they did. That's why it happened. So it isn't a bias to think, well, I'm just inherently better than other people. They don't know that they made these mistakes. This is kind of a central theme in ADHD. They don't see these things when they happen because that is part of the executive function, the ability to review these things as they happen. It's also worth talking about, I know I said I'd say something about multitasking before. And I said the multitasking myth, which will give you a hint where this is going. For as long as they were able to do cognitive research, they were generally able to show that people can only focus on one thing at a time. They can basically do one thing, and then if they try to do something else, their attention is divided. But multitasking has become a social buzzword. And people who are doing multiple things at once. The idea of talking on the phone while also typing an email or texting people while you're in a conversation at dinner and doing these things like that. And that this was something that many people valued. They said, like, I can do all these things. I have to multitask. That's what my job requires. So Stanford University in 2009 tried to do a study to show about about technology use, the idea of these kinds of tasks, phones and screens and all this stuff at the same time. They were trying to find out what made people good at this, since this was being touted by so many people. And they had a group of college students that they determined were high media multitaskers and low media multitaskers, people who said, no, I'm really not any good at that. So they tried to run tests and said, like, what makes these other people better at it? And the short version of it is they ran through 3 separate different kinds of cognitive tasks that were multitasking and requiring using differential attention and all this stuff. And they found that the people who were reporting themselves as high multitaskers were much worse in every one of those tasks, in every way that they did it, than the people who viewed themselves as not good at it. And that the longer they went through these tasks, the worse they became. One of the authors basically said these people, they were suckers for distraction, that they were distracted by everything. The interesting thing is, of course, they found at the end, it's like, well, nobody's good at multitasking. And people who think they're good at multitasking are actually really bad at it for the most part. But again, here comes the theme again. They're unaware that they're bad at it. They feel like they're being productive. They feel like they're paying attention. Now, if you look back at some of these things, like we looked at one symptom under inattention was like, difficulty with or avoiding or disliking things that require sustained attention, which is something that we're going to find with attention difficulties and executive dysfunction in general. Like that, these things are hard. So sometimes people will like go from task to task with the distraction, focusing on this, and it feels like paying attention. It is easier than sitting down and reading a technical manual. It's easier than sitting down and doing something that's hard like that. And then say like, oh, well, I'm here, I've got this, I've got it. But they don't. They're actually missing a great deal from thing to thing, but they're not necessarily aware of it. But it feels like attention. Now, if any of you have kids, or when you were a kid, or if you've just been around kids, you've probably come across this before, where somebody's trying to do their work, and like high school students doing their work and saying, well, I pay attention better if I have a show on, or I pay attention better if I'm listening to music, and I can text my friend when I do this. That helps me pay attention. No, it doesn't. It's like almost universally, it does not, but they think that it does. They think because it feels like paying attention. But they're missing things. And if you put this stuff together with the working memory deficits, they don't know necessarily what they're missing. It just feels better. So they feel like it's attention. So multitasking is pretty much a myth. Everybody does worse with it. Now, I know I said something before about multiple tasks, managing multiple tasks from the Harvard definition. So let's do a little experiment here. I use the same one all the time. I like it. So what I want everybody to do, anybody who's listening, I want you to pay attention to what I'm saying. I'm going to tell you to focus on some things. The first thing I want you to focus on is your shoes. If you're wearing shoes. If you're not, focus on socks. If you're barefoot, think of the feeling of your foot on whatever surface that it's on. Pay attention to that. Notice how it feels. Notice where it's tight or where it's loose. Now, notice your clothes. Any article of clothing. A watch, a necklace, a belt, shirt. You can feel it on you. Maybe some of it's uncomfortable. Maybe some of it is itchy. But what I'm guessing is you probably weren't thinking about any of these things until I told you to think about it, unless they were painful or something unusual about it. And in fact, I'm guessing that while I'm talking, if you're listening to what I'm saying now, you're thinking less about those things. You're thinking less about how your shoes feel. This is what it means to manage multiple tasks. Your nerves are constantly sending these sensations to you. If you just noticed your shoes, the feeling of the shoes on your feet when I mentioned it, you were still getting those same signals to your brain, but your brain is inhibiting those thoughts and allowing you to focus on something else. And that's what attention is, the ability to push down irrelevant things. The other thing I like to do is say, listen to the sounds around you. Does your computer have a fan? Can you hear it? Can you hear the HVAC system in your room? Are there other background sounds? Maybe you didn't notice those until I said them. It's the same thing. Your brain gets all of these sources of information all the time. It has to direct conscious attention to one thing at a time. So these things get pushed down, unless that system doesn't work very well for you. And then your attention is going to be divided among things that distract you. The brain has a harder time focusing on what is necessary and what's relevant. And we know the brain can't multitask. So we know that if you're focusing on this, or if you're trying to text somebody when you're also talking to somebody else, the attention can't serve two masters. It has to look at one. It has to focus on one thing. So the other thing is either viewed as irrelevant, or if you can't do that, then you're distracted. That's what these things feel like. So people who are distractible, a lot of times, this is one of the things, the way that they experience it. They can't necessarily automatically maintain this focus. It takes effort. Focus may drift to something else, and then it needs to be pulled back. I'll give you one thing that's another great example, you probably never thought of before. If you've ever been at a party and there's a whole lot of people talking, and you can focus on one person and hear their conversation, that is focused attention. That is executive function. That's a very specialized function that our brain has. Computers can't do that. You know, we have speech recognition programs, but they can't pull out one voice when multiple people are talking. But we do it automatically, mostly. Unless you have ADHD, and then you may find that very difficult to sustain attention in a room with a whole lot of people talking. Like focusing on one person may be difficult or even impossible, to at least to do for very long. So now we have a sense of what some of these things feel like. Let's talk about what it looks like, how it can affect you. The procrastination problem is my favorite one, because we see this all the time, where, say, like, you know, again, applied to students. So you give an assignment to a student, and they say, "Oh, I have a week to do this." That's plenty of time. I don't have to start this now. I've got all this time ahead of me. A week is a lot, so I'm not going to worry about it today. I have all these other things I want to do. I'll start it tomorrow. And then tomorrow comes, and it's like, let's do next week. It's not anything to worry about. I'll do it later. And then the next day, like, it's coming up soon, but that's fine. It'll be later. And then the next day comes and say, like, well, I should probably start something, but well, I do have to go to practice, and I have this. So I'll start it tonight. And then tonight comes around, and you say, like, well, it's late now, and I'm tired, and I don't want to do it. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll be more focused tomorrow. Like, you get the pattern here. It goes up to saying, like, well, I'm going to start it after dinner. I'm going to start it before bed. Like, oh, I don't have enough time now. I can't finish it. It ends up like where you're rushing and rushing and rushing, and maybe you do a very poor job of it, or maybe you don't finish it, or maybe you don't even start it. And then you go in the next morning, and you have an incomplete thing, or you don't have the project at all, or maybe you even left it at home, and then you're upset. And everybody's upset with you that you had all week to do this and you didn't do it. And then they tell you, like, you have to plan better, and you need to be more organized, and thinking, yes, I need to be more organized, and I'll plan better next time. But they won't, because that's the part that isn't working. They'll have that experience, but that feeling of I can do it later never goes away. It never changes. It always seems like there's enough time. It always seems like you can easily put forth the effort, regardless of the experience that you have. So you end up with people upset. You end up being upset with yourself, perhaps. You end up with this issue and then being faced with a consequence that you don't learn from, because the ability to do that is the thing that's affected. The ability to say, how much time do I need to do this? How much effort do I need? Oh, this is going to take 6 hours. I better start now. That doesn't happen naturally. So people end up making the same mistakes over and over again and feeling bad about themselves, often because they're told this. People will say, you just can't keep making this mistake. You have to do better. And they will try and internalize this. But the process of doing it is the thing that's affected. So let's talk very briefly about diagnostic issues. There are problems with diagnosis. So one thing we know is that more boys than girls are diagnosed with ADHD. What a lot of people don't realize is that more boys than girls actually do have ADHD. So it's not just that more are diagnosed, it is more common in boys. That being said, it is sometimes misdiagnosed because we go through that diagnostic criteria. Not everybody does. You will find certain other kinds of clinicians who may not pay as much attention to that, and then just may diagnose things on like, well, the parent says they have this difficulty, so let's do this. So what ends up often making the diagnosis, you think back to that ADHD iceberg. If you have acting out behaviors, you're a lot more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. If you're more inattentive, you are less likely to be diagnosed. And one thing that we see is that acting out kind of behavior is less common in girls for a lot of different reasons. There's social reasons, pressures, things like that. But it also means that it's going to be picked up less often in girls. It might even be overdiagnosed in boys because there are other reasons that boys sometimes act out. So you may have people who are overdiagnosed. You may have people, depending on who you are, like if you're female, if you have a higher IQ, you may be underdiagnosed. The higher IQ thing is important because if you're smart enough, for lack of a better term, like if you have a greater fund of the kind of skills you need to do in school, which is what IQ actually measures, not how smart you are. It's like, do you know the kinds of things you need to know in school, which is a great thing. People don't always understand that that's really what we're talking about. If you're really strong in all those things, you can have other weaknesses and still do okay, unless it's really bad. So what you'll see is people who maybe don't act out very much and have a lot of ability, they'll do okay enough, even though they have all these deficits, for a long time, but not forever. The problem becomes as you are expected to do more and more things on your own in terms of organizing things, these deficits catch up with you. The problem is the older you get, the more likely you are to be questioned or doubted for having this. So sometimes we'll have exactly this experience. Somebody with a very high ability, say top 2%, an IQ of 130 or above, and primarily inattentive ADHD, but they always kind of got things well enough that they could get things done. They could use those other skills until they get to college. And then they have to organize everything for themselves. And then they have trouble. And there's statistics about this, although they're weak because the studies are not huge. But in general, we know things along these lines. In samples of kids who go, who are college-bound high school students, or are eligible for college, about 77% of them in this country go on to college. But the percentage for similarly matched kids who have ADHD, it's only 22%. So something like a third of as many kids with ADHD actually go on to college. Once they get to college, about 35% of that original group of kids who go to college, the 35% who are eligible to go to college are on that track. 35% of them will actually finish. ADHD kids, it's a little less than half that, maybe 17%. Some studies say even lower. So they get to a point where once they're on their own, they have a hard time getting into college. Once they're in college, they have a hard time, twice as hard of a time, staying in college, because there isn't somebody there to tell them what to do next. They have to organize everything themselves. So all of these deficits now are the main problem. Not the ability to do the work, it's the ability to understand how much time it takes to do the work. We, in our practice, one thing we see is we're often doing ADHD evaluations for people that are even higher than this. So maybe they had milder abilities, but now they're in med school or they're in law school. We've had exactly those things. And they have ADHD. Now they're at a point where executive function skills are absolutely critical to what they do, and they can't do it. Despite having great ability and maybe even great grades, they can't manage this on their own. And they get a lot of skepticism from their programs. They're like, well, how could you have gotten this far if you have this problem? But that's what it looks like. If it's mild enough to let you get that far, you can get yourself to a point where these things will get in the way. So the diagnosis issue is that it can be different based on who you are and how you present. It's always easiest when the problem is the most obvious, when it's the most difficult. I mean, that's the same with any diagnosis. The more mild it gets, the harder it can be. So if you don't make a lot of noise, if you don't cause a lot of disruption, you may not be diagnosed, but you may still have trouble later when it falls on you. And if it's not college, maybe it's going to be work when you're expected to do these things on your own. Obviously, some kinds of jobs more than others. Now, I want to give you my favorite Russell Barkley quote. I know we have about 5 minutes left before we're going to do questions. And I want to show you something that to me is a very, very important analogy. And we have to get to the coaching stuff at the end. So my favorite Russell Barkley quote, and he's an ADHD researcher who's written quite a bit about this. He would say, ADHD then is a disorder of performance more than a disorder of skill, a disability in the when and where, and less in the how and what of behavior. Those with ADHD often know what they should do or what they should have done before, but knowing provides little consolation to them, little influence over their behavior, and often much irritation to others. Such knowledge seems to matter little when they actually are behaving at a particular moment. They know the rules, they know how they should have done it, but they can't do it. But that's always what they're asked. And that brings me to my favorite analogy, the color blindness analogy. And I apologize if anybody has this particular kind of color blindness. This is the most common kind, red-green kind. So if you have normal vision, you're going to see 3 different color apples. If you have red-green color blind, they're all going to look some various shade of yellow. So as you can imagine, this as an analog for ADHD, when people are saying, look, you just have to pick up the red apple. You have to quit picking up the green ones. And you have to quit picking up the yellow ones. You have to pick up the red one. And they're like, okay, but they can't see it. But we keep telling them to do it. And it doesn't matter how many times you tell somebody to do it if the process that allows them to do this is not working. So when we try and explain this over and over again, like, do you understand what you did wrong? Do you know what you needed to do here? It's like, yes, they do, but they can't. That doesn't help them change what they're doing. So what do you do instead? We don't try to fix executive functions. The same way we don't, at least, I don't think it's worthwhile to try and fix them. The same way you don't fix colorblindness. You support them. You come up with a workaround. You come up with modifications. You quit talking. It's worth explaining what they're supposed to do, but don't assume that that's going to fix it. Tell them there are 3 different colors of apples, but let's find a different way to do this. It helps that they know, but they're going to need something else to do it. You should, in my opinion, and I'm not a physician, you should consider, if the problem is significant enough, medication as an option. It has a pretty good track record, although like any other medication, there are problems and downsides. But there aren't too many other kinds of medications you can take for any other sort of psychological, psychiatric condition that you can only, you can take during the days when you need it and not the days when you don't, and you can stop if it isn't working without much of a, it's worth trying if it's going to help somebody do these things on their own, boost these abilities to control their behavior and their attention. Consider school supports. Schools are getting better about this. All of these kind of supports are going to follow the same thing, where I call it building habits, not processes, with the idea that we're going to take these executive functions that are not working so well, and we're going to try and externalize them some way, instead of doing like what we'll often hear working with schools, where they'll say, well, they just need to be responsible at this age. Like, that's a great idea, but that's not right. It doesn't matter how responsible they are or whether they should be able to do this by this age. Just saying that and presupposing that won't help this kid. So if you want them to learn the information, Don't expect them to get everything down in notes. How about, expect them to attend this and give them a copy of the notes. Do you want them to know the stuff, or do you want them to write notes? I want them to know the stuff, so if we can give them that. Do the old assignment book thing, where, say, like, the child has to write the assignment in a book. Then before they leave the classroom, the teacher checks it to make sure that it's correct and signs it, so that we know the information can get home. A lot of this is done electronically now, through school websites and things. But like, if the task can get home, then somebody can help them with it to say, oh, here's the, oh, you need to do this. But if they didn't remember it, if they don't get it home, or they're doing the wrong assignment, nobody can help them with that. Nobody can help them if they've forgotten. They need to know what it is. You can probably see a couple problems with this. It relies on other people being focused. The teacher must remember every single time to sign the book. The teacher must update the page, the web page, every day with the assignments. And a lot of times we see these things not happening. This is the difficulty with this. It requires other people to be on top of it, but it's still something to push for. School supports, some schools have things like where they have like a modified study hall, where kids with IEPs, with plans for educational support, can have a period a day or a few times a week where somebody goes through their backpack and makes sure that things are organized, make sure they have all their assignments, they haven't missed things. I can't tell you how helpful that is. That is one of the most helpful things that can be done. And remember, they're not doing the work for them. They're just making sure that they know. They're making sure what they have to do so that someone else can do some of those executive functions for them, and then the kid can actually perform the task, which is what we're going for. We talk about things like environmental modification. Like, if you want to do my analogy here of the apples, how about getting rid of 2 colors of the apples? Instead of making the kid differentiate, can we get rid of some of the things that are causing them problems? And the last thing is coaching. Now, this was not planned on my part, but there's a presentation through this same organization tomorrow that's going from this organization, CHAD, where they're going to talk about coaching. And a brief thing about this is coaching is not the same as therapy. Coaching is focusing people on the things they need to do to try and teach them habits, like I mentioned in the last slide, habits, rather than a process saying like, oh, you need to do this paper this way, you need to do this. It's always like, we need to figure out how long it takes to do something first. This is what we do first. We need to make sure we have our materials. We need to make sure, okay, we start working at this time every day, and that someone will check on them. An ADHD coach tells them what they need to do and then follows up with them. And this is something that psychologists like I did, when I was working in schools, where we would do things like a kid needed to do something in a class, have them come see me first and say, okay, when you go into this room, this is what you're going to need to do. You're going to do this, this, and this. Okay, let's repeat those. This, this, and this. When you're finished, I want you to come back and tell me how it went. So you're focusing their attention on the things they need to do. And then, so hopefully they're thinking about it, which keeps it higher up in their attention. And then it's going to be reviewed. So that whole idea of mental planning, you're not relying on them to make the plan on their own. You're making them focus on the plan. They still do the plan. They still review it, but they're using you as a support. So these are the kinds of things that you want to end up doing. An ADHD coach, it's really more for adults and to some extent for adolescents, but the principles of it are important. The idea of taking these ideas and instead of saying, oh, you need to be organized, say, here's what you need to do next. And then having them do it. Say, here's what happens after this. This is where the coaching comes in. Therapy for ADHD is really not very effective. You can give people therapy for the problems that happen around ADHD, from the difficulties they have. It's true. But you can't talk somebody out of ADHD. You can't explain things enough like this where they'll change. This is not the same. This is providing a series of actions that are concrete, and the idea of building habits to hopefully say, like, here's a way to approach every task. Once they get used to it, hopefully this is something they bring on and they can be more independent on their own. So I want to make sure that we still have time for questions. We have about 10 minutes left, and I would love to open the floor to questions. I can't see them at the same time, so they will be read to me. Do we have any questions by any chance?
Yes, we do. Okay, so first and foremost, thank you so much, Dr. Deibler. That was phenomenal. So I'm going to start on the questions. So our first question is, how can we know what let me try that again. How can we know what is age appropriate for a particular age? And then the second part of that is, are there gender expectations?
Yes, there are both. And I'm going to give you an example. This is why psychologists use the kind of tests that we do. So one of the things you can do is, if you have any questions about something that seems like, well, I'm not sure if this is appropriate or not, you can always ask somebody. At least like start off with that, saying like, is this okay at this age? Should this be happening? We do see inappropriate things sometimes, and I hate to say it, I've been in schools where this has come into the curriculum, where they expect kids at a certain age to sit down for very long periods of time because they think that reflects that it's a good educational program. It's like, well, kindergarten kids may not do that, and you can set an expectation that is age inappropriate. So the thing is, you have to measure your own expectations. If you decide to go for an evaluation someplace through the school or through a practice or anything like that, we have instruments that are designed for this. So when we're asking specific questions, they are measured against other kids. So the most common one that you're probably going to come across, which is my favorite probably psychological test of all time, is the BASC-3, the Behavior Assessment System for Children. And it's based on a sample of something like 10,000 kids of all different ages, all different clinical issues and things like that. So the idea is, when you look at responses on that, the child made, the parents made, and different versions of it, you're comparing them to everybody else. And it will give you a sense of, okay, now this is what's reported for a 6-year-old. How is that compared to other 6-year-olds? We can actually look at that and say, no, this is how 6-year-olds are. Or like, no, this is more impulsive than 95% of 6-year-olds. So that gives you something. The BASC also has things about executive function, which is nice. So that's the thing I want to a takeaway there, is to realize that if you're not sure, there are measures that can be done in a variety of settings that will help you describe your behaviors and then have that compared in a formal way to what's expected from other kids. I hope that answers the question.
No, I think that does. Thank you. Okay, so our next question is, do all of the symptoms have to be present in both environments?
I think most people interpret it that way, but the thing is, the symptoms, the thing we really look for is the symptoms are there. At least all of the symptoms can be put together from all the settings put together, but the impact is in more than one setting. So you don't have to show all the things, but if you have, say, 7 symptoms in one place and they can only say 4 in another, but both are impacted, that's good enough. You're looking for the impact, where both people would say, yeah, this is a problem.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So next question we have is, we always hear to let ADHD kids use things like fidget spinners, sensory items, etc. when doing schoolwork. Is this a good idea, or is this multitasking?
I'm going to tell you that you hear a lot of stuff like using those things, but there's virtually no research behind it. So I would say no, it's not a good idea. Unless, the thing is this, it is not helping people pay attention. That is clear. There might be a benefit of saying like, well, they're not doing something that's more distracting. That is possible. But you have to realize what the trade-off is. Like a kid doing a fidget spinner is not paying attention to their work, but maybe they're not getting up and disrupting the class. But that's the thing. Like this was a big issue for a lot of psychologists. Were like, oh, everybody should have fidget spinners. Like, where'd you get that? So it's like, it doesn't come from our work because it doesn't support that. The research isn't there to support it.
Okay, no, that's very good to know, because most people don't know that. I didn't know that. So our next question is, at what age do parents start to pull back from coaching so teens become more independent, for example, like in college?
This isn't an easy answer, but I'll put it this way. When I started off in this field, there were a whole lot of people who thought that you outgrew ADHD. And the evidence is pretty strong that you don't. But people become less impulsive. less fidgety, mostly, but they still have these difficulties. So I would say when you do things, you stop coaching efforts when they don't need it. And if they do need it, you continue it through your whole life if you have to. If you need help staying organized, you need to figure out what that is. The other thing you just have to realize is that if you're in public school, there's a lot of things can be provided for you. If you're in college or you're in the workforce, those things are not necessarily provided for you. You may have to take some steps to make that happen. You may have to have assistance in doing that. But there's a reason that we tell people to rely on the alarms on their phones and things like that. Like set an alarm at 3:30 every day. You're going to start reading. You're going to start, like, no matter what. Of course, phones present their own distraction, so you have to manage things. And I did want to go back to say one thing about fidget spinners and things like that. You're going to find this stuff sometimes in occupational therapy, and it does have a use there, but I'll tell you, they don't have research to support a lot of what they do with this either. At least not the research, not by the standards that we would. But it does show that a lot of times it stops more disruptive behavior, especially if you've seen like the seats you have to balance on. It stops it, or it can stop more disruptive behavior because they're focusing on that instead of on something else. But we shouldn't mistake that for that this will help them concentrate on their work. There's not really evidence for that.
Okay, gotcha. No, and that's so important to know. Thank you. And so another question that we have is, they said, curious about your reaction to recent news stories of high rate of diagnosing ADHD and prescribing Adderall for young adults that is being said to be occurring with online teletherapy groups like Cerebral.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the various groups. There's a lot of them. Well, now I'll try and answer that, but you're going to hear my own personal bias. And I don't freely say that this is my own bias based on the way that I was trained and the things that we do. I think there's a couple things to think about. They used to do, a lot of psychiatrists, and this is not knocking psychiatry, we're talking decades ago, they used to do what they would informally call diagnosis by prescription, where they would say, like, well, I don't know if the kid has ADHD or ADD at that point. Say, but we'll give them Ritalin, which is the first one you could get, a stimulant. And say, we'll give them Ritalin, and if they do better, then they have ADHD. Except it doesn't take long to figure out that everybody does better when they have a stimulant. It will help everybody perform better. It will, that's why do people drink coffee and tea every morning? People do better with stimulants. It's a different effect. But one of the reasons that people are getting stimulants these days is that a lot of people know that it has a positive effect. They're looking to increase their grades. Not a great idea because if you don't have this particular deficit, you're more at risk for having problems from doing this. And if you think about it also, it is an abuse of medication if you're going to do that. But it's common on college campuses where people will sell Adderall to people that want to do better on their tests. Whether it works or not, they think that it will. So we have that going on. When we talk about these other, so we have a lot of people that are seeking this. When we talk about how ADHD is diagnosed, the way we do it, we're going to try and establish that all of these criteria are met. We're going to try and measure it some way. It's difficult because most of these measures are not direct, they're indirect, like you're asking people. But we're trying to do that. And we do have some direct measures. It's a longer discussion, like whether they're useful or not is an issue. But in other settings, like primary care, they may use a single questionnaire, like the Vanderbilt or something like that, which will say, like, do they have this problem? Do they have this problem? And parents or the person themselves can say yes, 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 yes. These questions all have what's called face validity. Face validity just means, like, an item means what you think it means. That's measuring what you think it is. So a bad part about that is that, like, if you know what you want it to say, you know how to answer the question. So if it says, do you have trouble with attention? Like, I have terrible trouble with attention. Do you have trouble with impulsivity? Oh, I can't. Like, if you know what they're asking, you know how to answer it to get the results that you want. That's the downside. So you wonder sometimes with some of these people who don't know how to use clinical instruments or don't have the time to do it, they're going to use something that's easier to manipulate. So I'm concerned about that, not because it's telehealth, but sometimes because of the training and the quality level of the person at the other end. Are they doing an assessment, or are they asking you questions that you know how to answer to get what you want? It is interesting. One thing you may have seen is that everybody's having trouble getting their ADHD meds right now because there have been so many more diagnoses over the last year or so. The manufacturers anticipated a need for the year, and they've run out because they've had more prescriptions than they expected. So something is driving this. And I think it's going to be a little while before we find out exactly why, but we do know that there's a lot of people who are looking for this kind of medication right now from a variety of sources. So that's a long answer, but it's a difficult question.
No, that's completely understandable. I do have 2 more questions. Is it all right if we talk about them real fast?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
I have no time limits. I'm sequestered in my room with COVID.
Okay, just wanted to double check. I know some of the attendees might need to hop off. First and foremost, I just wanted to say thank you so much for attending. Tomorrow night on December 8th at 7:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will be continuing this conversation on ADHD at our Tourette Talk with Chad's founding director and ADHD coach herself, Jane Milrod. To register, please go to www.njcts.org/Tourette Talk. With that being said, the blog will be open around tomorrow, available for the next 7 days. Any questions that you may have or that we might not have been able to get to, feel free to post it on there. And it will be active for the next 7 days. And you can go to www.njcts.org to see, to be able to ask any questions, as well as get an archived recording of tonight's webinar. So now that we got that out of the way, next question is, I believe what this person means is with telehealth or any type of therapy or coaching for ADHD, it says that my problem, or the problem, is that it's not covered by insurance. I don't know what they were looking into, but they said $3K is very expensive. What can we do?
3,000?
Yeah.
For
I don't
the
know.
evaluation?
They didn't specify. I thought that sounded kind of high.
We've seen a range. A full psychological evaluation is expensive. 3,000 is toward the high end of that. We've seen some practices that charge 4,000 for a full neuropsych evaluation, which I can't agree with that. I don't think that's necessary. For an evaluation, it can be expensive because most of the time you're talking about kids, and you have to look into learning issues always when you're doing something like this, because ADHD and learning disabilities, which is the school term, or learning disorders, which is the clinical term, they're not exactly the same, but that's another discussion. These things commonly co-occur. So you have to do, if you're going to do this, an evaluation like this with kids, you have to do a lot of stuff, and it takes a lot. I don't think you need to do a full neuropsych evaluation to answer this question. If you're an adult, they frequently don't ask all these questions. You're not normally concerned about learning disabilities or things like that. If you're over 18 and you're out of school, then it's a much shorter process. It doesn't have to be this huge evaluation, and it should reflect that in the cost. A lot of these kinds of evaluations, though, for what it's worth, these can be done over telehealth, because it's just asking questions, or even having a person fill out a form. They don't have to be in the office for that. And I know that a lot of coaching is delivered through telehealth the same way other things are done. But I know insurance companies are funny about it. Some cover it standards and some do not. Sometimes it has to do with the level of practitioner. At our practice, we do telehealth. Most people seem to want telehealth, and we have a mix now of in-person and telehealth. And they're covered, but we're all licensed. So I'm not sure. But it's an issue. Telehealth is taking an unusual role right now. And some providers will say they want to use their own people, or they'll use, they have some other restrictions like that. But paying out of pocket $3,000 is a lot. I don't know the situation of the person here, but if it's a kid, remember that, like if a child is having particular difficulties that are affecting them in school, they should be eligible for an evaluation through the school district for free. Now that's an evaluation for special education services, but they have to, if they're affecting to that point, you need those kinds of supports. The school should evaluate to determine whether that's necessary, and that's at no cost, including if they have to send you to a psychiatrist for, like the way the school works in New Jersey, ADHD has to be determined by a physician. Not for us, but they'll usually take our stuff, but they have to refer out. They can't do it themselves, but they should pay for that. So if it's somebody in the public school system and they're having significant difficulty in school, I would explore that option first. It's not the same as a clinical evaluation, but it's free and you're entitled to it, especially if you think they need support in school beyond the regular stuff they do. If it's an adult, you may have to learn how to talk to your insurance company and see if they'll cover it. But just paying out of pocket $3,000 for an evaluation is a lot. And I would have to know that things are really, really bad before I would pay $3,000 just to find out the answer to a question. I hope that makes sense. But I'm always conscious of people's money. It's like, it's $3,000 is a lot of money.
No, it definitely is. And the person wrote through and said she meant the evaluation of ADHD by a clinical psychologist.
It could cost that much for a kid. It shouldn't cost that much for an adult. That's my own belief. It's like, that's not how I would do it. If it's an adult, I'm not doing the cognitive stuff. I'm not doing these other things. I'm doing maybe a third of that. And it's still, unfortunately, it probably would work out to over $1,000. But if I knew you had to pay for it out of pocket, I'd probably try and help you figure out some other way to do it. To say, like, well, do you want to go to a psychiatrist and do their evaluation? It may actually be shorter. They may not do tests. It'll still be probably close to $1,000. But it's hard to imagine they wouldn't pay anything. See what the insurance company will cover. What would they want you to do? See what they would cover.
That's a very good question. No, I definitely agree with that. So we have two more. One of them is when someone was diagnosed, when someone has a diagnosis of Tourette syndrome and OCD, not ADHD, but is clearly displaying symptoms matching what you describe, could it not be ADHD, but it was caused by their Tourette syndrome and OCD?
That's almost right. Yeah, that's very astute. But the thing is with this, with Tourette's, and that's the other, like the two disorders that we spend our time explaining over and over again are ADHD and Tourette's, because Tourette's is also poorly understood. Your organization helps tremendously with this, but most people, it's the same. Now, this is the way I look at it. For most people, unless tics are very severe, the tics are not the main problem. It's the other stuff that goes along with it. And for many people, like when we see someone coming in with Tourette's, we're expecting another diagnosis also, because that's usually it. You usually have another one. And the ones you're going to see the most commonly occur, you can have a lot of things that co-occur, but we look for three. So with Tourette's, a very high percentage also have OCD and also have ADHD. It's not that the Tourette's causes it. It is part of the same constellation of issues. The third one is like rage incidents. So acting out behaviors that don't fit a clear diagnostic profile, that's a tougher one to say because it doesn't fit a diagnostic. But most of the time, we kind of expect people with Tourette's, we're always looking to see if they also have OCD and ADHD. So if the person is demonstrating ADHD symptoms, you might want to consider two things. First of all, was the other diagnosis simply not correct? Did they just not realize the person also has ADHD? Because more often than not, they are going to have it. We expect it. Or if you are already getting treatment, if you don't have the full diagnosis, but you see things, you can still treat the symptoms. So it's something that you can try, or something you can explore. Say, like, they may not have everything, but we know this, at least these features commonly co-occur. So can we try and treat that and see if it helps? It's more common to come into issues with, they don't meet the full criteria for OCD. but they have a kind of Tourettic OCD profile that absolutely needs to be treated, even if they may not meet the full criteria. They usually do, but sometimes they don't. So for this, the one thing I want to get across to you is that you're probably right, is that this is an issue that needs to be treated. Whether they want to call it ADHD or not isn't as important as whether they're actually going to address the issues, the things that you see. I hope that makes sense.
No, it does. And then our last question, after this, we'll wrap it up. The last question is, I'm thinking my son has ADHD. He's a junior in high school. I'm worried about his procrastination and how he always starts off the year with A's, but then it starts dropping off, especially when he's getting bored. I'm worried when he goes to college or when he starts college.
So I understand. So if you're interested in getting a diagnosis, the thing that they're going to ask about, of course, is did he show symptoms of this before age 12? What I didn't mention before is, sometimes they'll call it subclinical. The idea that you can have problems with this, but not so severe that they call it a disorder. So the question will be that. It's like, is this just a weakness for him, but not enough to be considered a disorder, or is this a disorder that was missed? So you're looking for the impact to be clear before age 12, as opposed to like, well, this isn't something that he's great at, and now that he's being asked to do this all the time, this is something he's going to have trouble with. You can still use some of the same techniques. I mean, you're probably not going to look at medication or something if you're not going to get a diagnosis. You can use some of the same techniques. The thing to remember, though, people who do have executive dysfunction, they don't like these techniques either. They don't necessarily like to be focused because they don't see it. They don't see that there's an issue. There are a lot of people who just have problems with organization. They have problems with procrastination. They don't have a disorder. It's just a general weakness. Same thing with reading issues and anything else. Like, you can have trouble with this, but it's once you hit that threshold, it has to be significant impact. It has to be significant symptoms before we can say, now this is not just a regular variation. Like, not everybody's great at everything. No, this is a disorder. This is stopping them from doing what they need to do. That's going to be the deciding factor there. Is it enough to give them a diagnosis? And if it isn't, what can you do? These coaching techniques will help anybody that has a problem in these areas, as long as he buys in. I would give you one suggestion. People do, and this would require more time, definitely, to figure out what to do. But if there's things that he's motivated by, because you have to realize, like, especially when you have that adolescent brain and isn't finished with its high order thinking skills, like, you finish that development probably around age 25, so like long after all this is over, long after you've gone through all this stuff, that these things may not be very important to him, but if you can give him something to motivate him, especially if it's a subclinical kind of thing and not a disorder, it's like, if you do this, you can earn this, or you can have this. Not the idea of taking something away, but giving something. It's like, you maintain this, here's something you can earn. Something like that can keep motivation going. Sometimes people say that's bribery. It's like, no, that's reinforcement. It's like, you don't go to work and they don't pay you, right? It's like, if you're going to get something finished that's extra, like, I need you to put extra time into this extra effort, and I'll reward you for it. It's something to consider while you're looking at the other things like that. Give him something extra, if you can, something that is important to him, if he can meet the goals that you think he should have.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Deibler. So we're gonna wrap it up. So once again, tomorrow night, December 8th at 7:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will be continuing this conversation on ADHD at our Tourette Talk with CHADD's founding director and ADHD coach herself, Jane Milrod. To register, please go to www.njcts.org/Tourette Talk. Thank you so much for joining our webinar on what does it mean to have ADHD. There is an exit survey. Please take a moment to complete it. The webinar blog will be open shortly and available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for any additional questions that were not covered tonight, as well as any questions that you might have within the next couple of days. Now, that website to access it is www.njcts.org. Also, an archived recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to our website. Our next presentation will be on sensory processing disorder when everything is too much, presented by Dr. Felicia Castagna on Wednesday, January 18th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. With that, I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and thank you so much for attending.